The static stretching you're used to doing before playing a sport or doing some kind of physical activity is not as helpful in preventing physical injuries as you might think. You may already know this, but for those who don't, research published in the early 2000s showed that static stretching isn't significantly effective in preventing physical injuries, and I will explain exactly what some of the research included. You see, conventional wisdom in the 1990s held that static stretching before activity improved the overall flexibility of your muscles and tendons, serving as the ultimate shield against injury. But over the last few decades, a growing body of clinical evidence has completely dismantled that assumption, changing how elite organizations prepare their athletes. Before diving into the studies, it helps to understand these two types of physical injuries, namely muscle and tendon injuries. You see, a muscle strain is structural damage to muscle fibers, frequently occurring near the muscular tendinous junction. You can think of this as like the anatomical transition zone between two muscles. In this case, it's the pliable muscle tissue that blends into the stiffer tendon. On the other hand, you typically get tendon injuries from overusing parts of your body, like your knees, elbows, or Achilles. These sorts of injuries are broadly known as tendinopathy. You see, tendons are dense, collagen-rich tissues designed to transmit the force generated by your muscles directly to your bones. They have a lower metabolic rate and poorer blood supply than muscles, meaning they adapt to stress much more slowly. When failure occurs, it depends entirely on the type of load, the speed of movement, and tissue preparedness. There's research that suggests static stretching can indeed increase your range of motion, but research studies also suggest it's not effective in preventing physical injuries, specifically tendon injuries. I'll go over these research studies in some detail, but to understand why static stretching falls short as a preventative shield, we first need to look at exactly how a muscle strain happens in real time. The core mechanism behind a muscle strain in sport is high force applied while the muscle is actively lengthening. This is called an eccentric contraction. This specific action is the primary decelerator during sprinting, cutting, jumping, and sudden stops. Strains typically occur in the muscular tendinous region because it is mechanically vulnerable to sudden shifts in high-speed tension. Several variables dictate whether a movement is perfectly safe or results in a catastrophic strain. A sudden spike in intensity, like running an all-out sprint for the first time in weeks, drastically increases the demand on the tissue. And experiencing fatigue late in a training session will reduce neuromuscular coordination, limiting your ability to distribute force safely. Now, it's worth saying that this inadequate eccentric strength means the muscle cannot absorb the necessary energy at extreme ranges of motion. Let's walk through an example. Imagine a recreational soccer player who does a light warm-up and immediately executes repeated maximal sprints. Late in the game, fatigue compromises their stride mechanics. During the late swing phase of the sprint, the hamstring is actively lengthening while producing massive amounts of force. The high-speed eccentric demand exceeds the tissue's physical capacity, resulting in sudden microscopic tearing of the sarcomeres. The player feels a sharp pain and loses their stride, marking a classic hamstring strain. Now, while muscle strains occur during rapid lengthening under force, tendon injuries develop through different motions. Tendon injuries generally follow two common pathways. The first is overuse, resulting in tendinopathy. This occurs when you subject the tendon to repeated loading without adequate recovery or progressive tissue conditioning. Over time, this chronic microtrauma leads to extracellular matrix disorganization, localized pain, and reduced mechanical function. The second pathway is an acute rupture. This happens when a single high-strain load exceeds the ultimate tensile capacity of the tendon, an event that frequently occurs on a background of pre-existing silent degeneration. Tendons are highly sensitive to load changes because they adapt strictly to progressive mechanical stress. When you abruptly increase your training volume or intensity, the physical demand simply outpaces the slow biological adaptation rate of the tissue. Tendon pain is almost never a tightness problem. It is a tissue capacity and load management problem. For example, let's consider a new runner who suddenly transitions from 2 short runs a week to daily high-speed hill sprints. The Achilles tendon is subjected to a massive spike in high-strain eccentric loading. Morning stiffness and localized pain begin to appear. If the athlete attempts to resolve this by simply stretching more while maintaining the same running volume, the symptoms will persist or worsen because the fundamental mismatch between load and capacity remains unaddressed. So if load mismatch drives tendon failure and dynamic force drives muscle strains, we must ask why static stretching became the universal preventative prescription in the first place. Well, Prior to the 1990s, the rationale for static stretching appeared logically sound. The prevailing theory suggested that increasing a joint's range of motion and reducing perceived muscle stiffness would make the entire muscle tendon unit more compliant. A more compliant tissue, researchers assumed, could absorb more kinetic energy before failing during explosive athletic activity. This idea gained immense traction following influential field studies in the early 1980s. A prime example is the clinical work by Professor Jan Ekstrand and Dr. Jan Gilquist published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine, which implemented a comprehensive injury prevention program across elite Swedish soccer teams. The intervention reported a significant reduction in injury rates, and because static stretching was a core component of the program, it was heavily credited for the success. However, a major scientific issue lay hidden in the methodology. The protocol was entirely bundled. Teams were given a multi-part routine that included an active warm-up, static stretching, prophylactic joint taping, and protective equipment education. Because the intervention was multifaceted, it was impossible to confidently isolate static stretching as the active mechanism reducing the injuries. This glaring methodological blind spot set the stage for a major scientific debate as researchers began trying to isolate the true effects of passive stretching. Throughout the 1990s, the sports medicine community fractured into two distinct camps regarding injury prevention. On one side, proponents of stretching pointed to observational data linking poor flexibility and high muscle stiffness to an elevated risk of strain. You see, because static stretching measurably increased range of motion, they concluded it was inherently protective and widely adopted it into standard practice. On the opposing side, a growing group of skeptics noted that controlled clinical trials consistently failed to show meaningful reductions in overall injury rates from pre-exercise static stretching alone. Furthermore, in something entirely unexpected, physiological evidence emerged showing that acute, long-duration static stretching could temporarily depress muscle strength and power output. In essence, several researchers argued over severe methodological frictions that plagued the era's data. Studies used vastly different stretching doses, ranging from brief 15-second holds to exhaustive multi-minute protocols. They used different injury definitions, often conflating specific muscular tendinous strains with general joint sprains. Here's an example. This friction was meticulously documented in systematic reviews by researchers like Weldon and Hill in 2003, Thacker and colleagues in 2004, and Herbert and Gabriel. These reviews looked back at the 1990s trial data and concluded that routine pre-exercise static stretching provided a limited to zero statistically significant reduction in general sports injury risk. But finding a definitive answer to this debate required massive amounts of controlled data, leading large-scale organizations to fund their own rigorous prevention trials. The push for rigorous injury prevention research was driven by organizations with an immense operational interest in minimizing training downtime. Elite soccer clubs, influenced by Ekstrand and Gilquist's early clinical work, were highly motivated to keep expensive athletes on the pitch. Consequently, international bodies began supporting extensive injury surveillance programs to protect their investments. Simultaneously, military organizations became the ideal controlled testing ground. Militaries processed thousands of recruits through high-volume, uniform physical training regimens. Because acute lower limb injuries cost the military millions of dollars in medical discharge and delayed operational readiness. Organizations like the Australian Army and the United States Armed Forces funded large-scale, randomized controlled trials to definitively test stretching protocols. Furthermore, international sports governance bodies, specifically the International Olympic Committee's Medical and Scientific Commission, began synthesizing this massive volume of data into formal injury prevention handbooks. These groups fundamentally care about availability, training continuity, and resource management. They push the science forward because the financial and operational costs of lost personnel demanded an evidence-based answer, even if that answer completely contradicted traditional athletic dogma. The data produced by these major operational organizations is what started the large, multi-phase shift in how we view athletic preparation today. The clinical perception of static stretching shifted through 4 distinct phases over the last 40 years. Phase 1 treated stretching as absolute dogma, heavily influenced by the multi-component soccer prevention programs of the 1980s that popularized the practice. Phase 2 emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s, characterized by systematic reviews questioning the actual evidence base and highlighting weak or entirely negative results. Phase 3 marked the definitive consensus shift away from routine pre-activity stretching. In 2008, Small and colleagues published a systematic review finding moderate to strong evidence against routine static stretching for overall injury reduction. This was aggressively reinforced in 2014 by Lauerson's massive meta-analysis of over 26,000 participants, which suggested that while strength training dramatically reduced injuries, stretching alone had no meaningful preventive effect. We are now in phase 4, where clinical nuances now exist. A 2024 meta-analysis by Takeuchi indicates that while static stretching remains completely ineffective for tendon injuries, it may provide targeted reductions in specific muscle strain injuries. Yet the modern has become clearer. The takeaway is not that stretching is useless. The takeaway is that static stretching is an incredibly weak standalone injury prevention strategy, especially when you lump all injury types together. So, if static stretching is a weak standalone tool, we should clarify exactly how and when you should actually utilize it in your own routine. You see, static stretching is absolutely not a waste of time, provided you apply it for the correct physiological adaptation. It is a highly reliable mechanism for increasing joint range of motion and improving tissue flexibility. As modern evidence suggests, it may even possess targeted value for mitigating specific muscle strains in individuals with acute mobility deficits. However, it is probably not a substitute for progressive loading, eccentric strength development, or active neuromuscular preparation. If you personally enjoy static stretching before your workouts, current physiological guidelines suggest keeping the holds very brief and pairing them directly with a dynamic, active warm-up to prevent acute performance drops. You should save the longer multi-minute static holds for post-training routines or entirely separate mobility sessions. In those contexts, your primary goal is chronic tissue adaptation and flexibility rather than immediate power output and dynamic force absorption. With passive stretching demoted to a secondary role, the focus shifts to the active, evidence-based protocols that actually bulletproof the body. The current evidence hierarchy for preventing lower limb sports injuries places strength training and multifaceted neuromuscular programs far above isolated stretching. As demonstrated by Lauerson's comprehensive meta-analysis, progressive strength exposure actively changes tissue capacity, making it the superior preventative tool. Neuromuscular warm-ups are highly effective because they improve movement quality, dynamic joint control, and landing mechanics, rather than just passively increasing range of motion. The Nordic hamstring exercise, for example, possesses a strong evidence base for reducing hamstring strain rates by safely exposing the muscle tissue to high-tension lengthening. You can execute a modern, evidence-based pre-activity routine in 12 to 15 minutes. Here's a stretch routine you could consider doing. You can begin with 2 to 3 minutes of temperature elevation via an easy jog or jump rope. Then move into 3 to 4 minutes of dynamic mobility using walking lunges, inchworms, and leg swings to open your active range of motion. Next, spend the next 4 minutes on activation and control, using single leg balance reaches and bodyweight squats with a pause to dial in proprioception and bracing. Then, spend 3 minutes on sport-specific build-ups, executing progressive sprint accelerations from 60 to 90% effort alongside low-volume pogo hops, emphasizing soft landings. Finally, if appropriately programmed, you could include 1 to 2 minutes of a micro-dosed eccentric movement, like the Nordic curl. But it's important to know that the singular caveat here is adherence. As the International Olympic Committee Handbook stresses, the best injury prevention program in the world is entirely useless if you do not perform it consistently. So to maximize the effectiveness of this template, it's helpful to modify these stretches to directly target the specific tissue you're trying to protect. So the most effective pre-activity approach you can consider taking today is a consistent, active, neuromuscular warm-up paired with targeted strength training, especially eccentric strength for those strain-prone muscle groups. You'll build your tissue capacity, manage your training loads intelligently, and prepare your body for the specific forces it will encounter. Hopefully you've learned something new. And until next time, stay healthy.